All right, everyone, welcome back to the podcast and the show. I'm happy to welcome back friend of the pod, David French. You know him as an opinion columnist at the New York Times. David French, great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me back. It's great to see you.
You had a great column in the New York Times, and the question that you ask, or they say people ask religious folks, is: do you go to a fear the world church, or do you go to a love your neighbor church? And I thought that was a great way of putting this dichotomy.
Yeah. I've been talking to an awful lot of people right now who are struggling with their faith in this moment. There are a lot of people who are asking questions about church. A lot of them very surprised, for example, at the church's embrace of Donald Trump. And as the more people I talk to and the more who are kind of going through this crisis of faith as a result of it, I began to notice some very similar patterns of the traditions they were coming from. And I put the title sort of Fear the World to label those traditions, sort of talking about like your more fundamentalist churches where essentially you're viewed, if you go to secular schools, that's viewed as like a danger zone. If you have too many secular friends, that's a danger. If you're reading too many secular books or watching too many secular movies, where you're sort of approaching the world in a kind of a defensive crouch that all about me are threats. And this is exactly the community that Donald Trump resonates with so very powerfully, because his fundamental posture towards the world is one of seeing the world around him as beset with threats and people to be fought. And so even though Trump doesn't have, say, the same theology as sort of the Fear of the World church, it's the similar disposition. It's a very similar cultural approach in the sense of seeing threat and seeing yourself as living in a world of threat, as opposed to, I grew up in I would call my family that I grew up as a love your neighbor family. And I'm blessed to go to a love your neighbor church. And they don't see the world out there. They don't see things outside the church as a threat so much. They see it as an opportunity to serve. And so that kind of mindset approaches the world in a much different way, a more hopeful way, a more confident way. And so I've been noticing that distinction over and over and over again.
I think that's a great distinction. And what hits me as I'm listening to you talk, I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh all the time, and Rush was not really a deep religious person. His conservatism pre-Trump was what I would call more of an abundance mentality. It was, you're not a victim, you can be successful and go out there and find a way. And I think that flies in the face of this current victim mentality, which I think is part of this fear of the world theology.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Rush as an example, because a lot of people who didn't follow the arc of his career, and by the time he passed, a lot of people had sort of forgotten how he rose. And one of the things about him, now look, his rhetoric was always over the top. He was an over the top person at all times. But earlier in his career, there was a sort of a joie de vivre about it, a sort of an essential optimism about it that was infectious. And so what was interesting about listening to Rush, say 25, 30 years ago, is yeah, there were times he would say something that would make you cringe, but most of the time it was a message of optimism, of engagement. And this just began to turn and turn and turn. And by the time that Trump rose, Rush was not as dark as Trump was early on. But by the end, I remember tuning in, and I hadn't heard him for a few years. It had been, I'd listened to him a lot when I was much younger. And then just, who has time to listen to all that talk radio had kind of fallen by the wayside. But when Trump rose, I tuned in. I thought, I want to hear what Rush is saying. I'm very interested. And it was almost unrecognizably different, Matt. It was the darkness in the tone of his voice, the darkness of the outlook. And it really does, in many ways, I think, mirror the progression that we've seen in the larger conservative movement, this move away from the kind of Reagan inherently optimistic approach to life to one that is now very dark and very apocalyptic.
Absolutely. Now, someone who had the love your neighbor church, maybe to a fault, worldview would be Pope Francis. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on his passing and on his legacy.
Yeah, that's a great segue, because I think if you're going to talk about who is a love your neighbor religious figure in the world, Pope Francis would have been front of mind. I mean, if there's one word that you would use to describe Pope Francis, it would be pastoral. He was a person who really, really cared for the members of the church individually and paid special attention to the most vulnerable. And so in many ways, Pope Francis, by his example, was living out a very different kind of faith than what was being put forward in America as political Christianity in America. And so it's no surprise that there were tensions between, say, a Pope Francis and not just, American conservative Catholics, but sort of the American Christendom writ large seemed to be moving away. Not all of it, of course, not all of it, but a lot of American Christendom seemed to be moving away from that love your neighbor pastoral approach of Pope Francis and much more towards that combative culture war, fear the world approach. And that's not a positive change. That is a very negative change. It turns people inward. It makes them insular. It makes them angry. Pope Francis, in many ways, was a living contradiction to that more insular and fearful worldview.
I think, when you look at history, whether it's the Nazis pretended to be Christian, but secretly, for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think Hitler, from a Nietzschean standpoint, saw it as a weakness and why would you want to help vulnerable, pathetic people? We want less of them. Similarly, was it Stalin or Marx, someone who said that religion's the opiate of the masses, that they were atheistic. It seems like there is a certain philosophy that says, caring for the least among us, that's weak. That is weakness. Of being about sacrifice, washing. You can't imagine Trump, washing the feet of someone who has AIDS or something like that. The things that Pope Francis, I believe, has done. It is a complete dichotomy. Once again, these worldviews are very much at odds, and there's always been a tension, of course, but I think it's very stark these days.
Yeah, it's extremely stark. And it runs very deep, Matt. So there was this very interesting is maybe a bit of a understatement way of describing it. I would say very blasphemous development that we saw before Easter, and that was Paula White, who was Trump's, lead spiritual advisor, sort of been his right-hand woman in the faith world since early in his political rise. And she was putting out that she was going to, for the low price, Matt, the low price of a suggested donation of $1,000, you were going to get a series of blessings and a Waterford crystal cross. Okay. So sounds a little bit like, sounds a little bit like selling indulgences. I don't know. For $1,000, you're going to get some spiritual blessings. Yeah, that's a little rough. But one of the things about this is so there's the scandal of just selling this, right? There's the scandal of selling blessings. But if you go back and you look at what was she selling? So what was she selling was you were going to, for $1,000 more, you were going to get health, you were going to get wealth, you're going to get an angel will be assigned to you. And here's this weird thing. God will be an enemy to your enemies. So what they're selling spiritually is they're trying to sell to people power and prosperity. And that, so you're right there. What is it that you're looking for in that relationship? It becomes very transactional, right? I give my 1,000 and I get health, wealth, prosperity, and power, including my enemies being smited.
Yeah.
And that is not the Christianity of my youth, shall we say. That is not it at all. But you can see how it fits culturally with Trump, who is a very transactional person. And in the transactional persons, what does Trump promise you? Health, wealth, power. I mean, make America healthy again, make America great again. It's health, wealth, it's power. And so you're beginning to see the politics of Trumpism and the religion of Trumpism are rowing in the same direction now. And it's very disturbing to see.
Well, David, you are a great guest for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is, man, we could talk about faith, we could talk about military stuff. We could talk about lawyer stuff. You wear many hats, and let's talk. I want to ask you about the Pete Hegseth, this latest scandal. So this time, he was apparently on Signal using his personal phone, telling his wife, who is not in the Pentagon, does not work for the Pentagon, his brother and lawyer, who I guess do, but did not have a need to know when and where we were going to bomb the Houthis or whatever. Now, this comes on the heels of the first scandal, which is slightly different. And my initial reaction was, nothing's going to happen. Like, Trump's not going to fire him because they're not going to give a scalp. They're not going to give the media a scalp for a variety of reasons. Trump doesn't want to like admit he was wrong or incentivize like a feeding frenzy. But now there's reports that maybe Hegseth is on, thin ice. What do you think?
Yeah, at the present moment, under the present scandals, I think he can survive these current scandals. Excuse me. Let me start that over. Under the present moment with the present scandals, including the double signal scandal, I think he can survive simply because he does exactly what Trump wants him to do, which is respond by scandal by aggressively attacking the media, never backing down. I mean, you'll watch him when he's interviewed. Oftentimes, it's like he's not even talking to the people around him. He'll turn and just talk straight into the camera. I mean, this is a guy who has mastered the Trumpian method of dealing with scandal, which is just flip it around and attack the media. So also Hegseth has a number of supporters who are among the most faithful MAGA voices. And so just like when his nomination was in danger and MAGA rallied to his side, right now his term in office is in danger and MAGA is rallying to his side. But I'll say this, Matt, this may not be the end. This may not be the end of the reporting on him. And in fact, I would say odds are it is not the end of the reporting. So it is one thing to say if it's just and I shouldn't say just, because Signalgate is terrible. The initial reporting, the initial scandal, if he'd been a Captain Hegseth instead of Secretary Hegseth, he'd be in custody. He would be in custody. He would be told to find a lawyer. The best case scenario he would be facing would be a dishonorable discharge under those circumstances. This next one is even worse because he's sharing it with people who don't have any clearance to receive the information. The negative of the first was he was using a platform that you should not use for classified information, but at least he was sharing it with people who had, like a Secretary of State or others had reason to know, to be read in. His wife doesn't. Look, if he's going to be late home from work, you just say, I'm going to be late from work. You don't say when the F-18s are taking off. I mean, so these scandals would destroy the career and perhaps end the liberty of any uniformed officer. And here he is, he's going to skate through it. But I don't know that this is all there is, Matt. So stay tuned.
Yeah. Do you have any read on guys like him, like the mentality? I don't know if you've ever met him specifically, but just being in serving, like, is this he seems like maybe a type of guy.
He is a type of guy in the military who is not very common. Okay. There is a kind of person like him in the military that you'll encounter, very forward with how physical they are, very aggressive, lots of bravado, etc. And in my experience, look, and I don't have the most experience in the military, but in my experience in the military, those people are often kept at arm's length or looked at suspiciously. Like, what's going on here? Why do you have so much bravado? Because bravado is people look askance at bravado. Because one thing about the military is the person you're standing next to, they could have done things in their life and they could have done things downrange that people could make a movie about. But you don't know because they're not talking about it. They're not talking about how bold and brave or whatever they are. So there's a certain inherent humility that comes with wearing the uniform because in many ways you're serving alongside a lot of heroes, and that should give you a lot of pause. And it should make you kind of dial it down a bit. Hegseth turns things up to 11. Now, there's a kind of a person in the military that does gravitate to that. There's no question. The person who's like, look at him. He's doing push-ups with the troops. Look at him. He's running with the troops. And soldiers do appreciate that. And I think that that's an example of a good way to lead. But if you're sort of putting fitness forward and operational security in the rearview mirror, that's not the trade that any soldier wants to make. I think they'd rather have a Secretary of Defense who maybe can't do as many push-ups as your median SEAL, but will at least keep operational plans secret and use communications channels responsibly. Because the one thing about the military is you are respected if you do your job well, your job. If you do things that are not your job well, also, you get maybe more respect. But if you can't do your fundamental job, all that other stuff, push-ups, burpees, etc., that doesn't take you very far.
And I've noticed that there's a resentment toward JAG officers. They're calling them JAG offs. I think maybe Hegseth might even be part of this. What's that about, and how problematic is that?
So there is a kernel of legitimacy, but most of it is not. So a lot of folks who served in Afghanistan in particular, maybe even more so than Iraq, encountered some very, very restrictive rules of engagement. Sometimes those rules of engagement were too strict. I wrote a whole big piece about this, well, I think it was back in 2015, that some of the rules of engagement were too strict. And then the people who interpreted the rules of engagement and explained them and advised the command were JAG officers. And sometimes you had JAG officers who would interpret those rules of engagement that were already too strict in a way that was even more strict than it needed to be. And this is something that when people's lives are on the line and they get a dubious legal interpretation that constrains them, there's legitimate reason for concern there.
Can you give me an example of?
Sure.
Can you just give me an example of, like, if the rules of engagement were too strict, what that might look like?
Yeah. So for example, there are rules regarding not just if civilians are present, but if you can't confirm that civilians are not present, being unable to use certain kinds of weapons and deploy certain kinds of, mainly not being able to deploy certain kinds of weapons, which goes beyond the laws of war, by the way. So the laws of war, if you're being directly engaged, say from a building, and you're receiving fire directly from a building, there were times in rules of engagement where you could not call in artillery to deal with that building unless you were 100% sure, say, for example, that there were 0 civilians in the building you were taking fire from. That there's obvious reasons for that, Matt. Like you can explain, like, we really, really, really do not want civilian casualties. So huge reasons for that.
And not only for humanitarian reasons, but maybe for mission reasons.
Right. So these are not like arbitrary made up rules. But if you're a young soldier on the receiving end of deadly fire, and maybe somebody who's as close to you as a brother is laying wounded beside you, and you cannot use the full force of the American military to extricate yourself from that position, you could see why and how it could build resentment. So that's the point. But the problem is that, no, you don't take aim at the JAG officers. The JAG officers don't make the rules. The JAG officers interpret the rules. And the JAG officers actually assist and help the commander in living up to the law and obeying the law. You can remove JAG officers, and that doesn't actually change the law. It just makes it more likely that commanders and others will violate it. And so what JAG officers do at our best is we empower the lawful mission of the military. And so we take, say, the desire to take this hill or occupy this town, or you name it, and we channel it through the law of war so that when we're conducting our military operations, we're conducting them lawfully, we're conducting them honorably, and then we facilitate that process. But also, we're part of the process of accountability. And if there's one thing that we know from, say, a Pete Hegseth, is he doesn't love accountability. And so, that direct attack on JAG officers, removing them, that JAG generals, without any evidence that they had committed acts of misconduct at all, sent a message to the military, essentially, that listening to the legal counsel of your lawyers is now kind of a luxury, maybe not really necessary. But that doesn't change the law, Matt. The law is still there. We still have to comply with the laws of war. And having a SecDef who, for however long he's in power, kind of lifts the oversight, doesn't mean that it removes the law. And so this is the tension that we're facing.
Well, speaking of complying with the law, I want to ask you about Abrego Garcia, who has been sent to El Salvador. As far as I know, there are no ties of him being a gang member. That seems to be erroneous. Maybe he's not a perfect model husband or father, Maryland man or whatever. But the other thing is, Garcia's not the only guy who seems innocent who's been disappeared into the gulag of in El Salvador. There's several. There have been judges' orders defied. The Supreme Court, of course, told the Trump administration to, quote, facilitate his release. So far, it seems like that hasn't happened. I'd love to just get your broad take, and then as a lawyer, as someone who studies constitutional law, where does this go?
Boy, we're in a dark moment. So let's just talk about Abrego Garcia for just a moment, and then we'll go to the larger issue. All of the debate over whether or not he's a member of MS-13, all the debate on whether or not he's a good dude, all the debate on whether he's a spouse abuser or a good husband, all of that irrelevant for now. Irrelevant, okay? Here's what's relevant. He was sent to El Salvador in spite of a court order saying he should not go to El Salvador. And then when the administration confessed its mistake, it now refuses to facilitate his return in outright defiance of a district court thumbing his nose at the Supreme Court. Look, if he goes back, that's when you adjudicate all this other stuff, because he has not been found by a court definitively to be a member of MS. There was some evidence presented through a confidential informant and also some of his clothing, and that was that. No real opportunity to contest it. He has no criminal convictions. But again, all of that is irrelevant. That's what you deal with once you correct the mistake the administration says that it made. And again, this is the mistake the administration says it made. It's the one who said we shouldn't have deported him to El Salvador. That's the only relevant fact for right now. You return him home and then you do deportation process the right way. And if the right way indicates he's deportable or a member of MS-13 or whatever, then you respond accordingly. But for right now, the relevant facts are he was deported to El Salvador by mistake, and the administration, rather than acknowledging the mistake and facilitating his return, is doubling down and thumbing its nose at the court. It's remarkable. And again, you are exactly right. By highlighting him, I sometimes fear that we have forgotten about 200 plus other people who, without any meaningful due process, were sent to this El Salvadoran prison.
Well, like there's this gay Venezuelan makeup artist and hairdresser, Andre, I think is his name, who seems to be even cleaner, less potential ties than Garcia to any sort of gangs. So yeah, I mean, when you're rounding up all these people, you're going to make mistakes, and you're just shipping them off. Throw them into planes and get them out of here. And then just the dehumanization, David, I have to tell you, the forced shaving their heads, shaving them. Kristi Noem doing this photo in front of them. They're not wearing shirts for reasons I don't understand. It's like a big game. It's like you just killed like a buck deer and you're holding up like to show off the antlers. Like these are the guys that it seems so sick and perverse.
It's gross. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's they have sent people. Reuters did an analysis of took 50 of the prisoners and found that about 27 had pending asylum claims when they were sent to this El Salvador prison. So they're sent to an El Salvador prison, which, by the way, if it existed in the United States, would be a constitutional violation all by itself. There are reports that the administration wants some of these, as far as it's concerned, those people can stay there for life in a prison that would violate the Eighth Amendment if it was in the United States of America. And by hustling them on planes, many of them no convictions, certainly none necessitating life in prison.
It's like hell, except it's not eternal. But I mean, you are disappeared, you're packed in, and you don't even know if anyone knows that you're there or where you are, or if you'll ever. It's not like, hey man, I just have to make it 10 years and then I'm out of here. Who knows?
I mean, and look, unlawful entry is a misdemeanor level crime. So if you cross the border without permission, and this is without legal authorization, and it's your first time doing it, now repeat offenders, it can rise to the level of essentially a felony. But a first-time border crosser, it's essentially a misdemeanor level crime. So a lot of these people are like, well, he broke the law and whatever they get. Wait a minute. I mean, we're talking about like misdemeanor level stuff. If you had let's say like a nephew, a 17-year-old nephew, he's driving way too fast one night and he gets a reckless driving misdemeanor citation. El Salvador in prison for life, would that be fine with you? And then when that happens and you're complaining about the inhumane treatment of your nephew and you say, and somebody says, well, he shouldn't have been reckless driving. Part of justice is proportionate punishment for the crime. Crossing into the United States does not merit life in prison or anywhere close to that in inhumane prison conditions.
And to your point, David, I don't understand I don't know if it's empathy or what the word is, but just I think as an intellectual exercise, like, what if this happened to me or my child? And there's also like karma, like maybe this will happen to me if I if I encourage it in someone else. Like, do they like when Kristi Noem is standing there doing that disgusting photo op? Like, I mean, does she not imagine like that this could be her in a different world or maybe even this world?
That's a great question. Look, these guys are governing like they're never intending to leave power. Or they're governing in a way that they feel like, okay, the Democrats won't do this, but we will. And that is remarkably short-sighted because, I don't know if you've seen some of this I don't know if you've seen some of the reports about, in this internal Democratic struggle about how do you respond to Trumpism. Excuse me. In this internal Democratic struggle about how to respond to Trumpism, there are people saying fight fire with fire.
Yeah.
Beating Trumpism.
I did a Substack post yesterday about President AOC, and I listed the things that she might do. This was all satirical, but it was one of them was, rounding up, I don't know, red state hunters and sending them to green gulags, because their carbon footprint is too large or whatever. I mean, you can just imagine. And, I was trying to have a little fun with it. It's as dark and disturbing as it is because maybe it's the only way. But don't they think like this could happen to us at some point?
They don't. Like, Matt, they don't. Now, some of them will say, Matt, it already happened to us, the political prosecutions of the J6ers and Trump. But that's just not a credible you're not having a credible conversation when you hear that. Like the idea that the January 6th rioters were somehow railroaded. Now, I'm not going to say that all 1,000 plus prosecutions were handled perfectly. I'm sure you could point me to somebody who had some procedural mistakes in their trial or whatever. But as a group, this idea that they were railroaded utterly at odds with reality, and especially the federal prosecutions of Trump, amply supported by the evidence. And so a lot of them take the position, well, we're just doing to the Democrats what they already did to us. But most of them know they can't make that argument with a straight face. And so I think the argument becomes essentially, no, what we're doing like this hard reboot, hard reset, and then we can rebuild America. That's not the way a lot of Democrats look at it. They look at it as this isn't some sort of reboot reset. This is just pure malice and vengeance. And they're coming for us. And there are some Democrats who say our response to that has to be to restoration of the rule of law and the norms of liberal democracy. And then there are others who say they're coming for us. You best believe we're going to come for them. And if that latter faction becomes the dominant faction, I mean, we're just, at that point, we're just in a world of trouble.
And the latter idea could be the result of either fear or retribution, right? You could do it out of vengeance, or you could say, we got to get them before they get us. We saw what Trump just did with one term. If he gets back in power, there'll never be another election. There will never be another. So it's basically the apocalyptic rhetoric that Trump uses, except they will really believe it, and they'll have cause to believe it in a way.
Well, the next administration is going to be in a very interesting bind. So the next Democratic administration, I would say, because one of the things that we're seeing with the Trump world right now is if you are with Trump, if you are for Trump, you live with a degree of impunity that I just have never seen in American political life. I mean, let's suppose that there's evidence that Elon Musk violated securities laws. Let's just imagine this as a hypothetical. Could you see the Trump Department of Justice pursuing that aggressively? No, not at all. So, however,
Elon would just fire the people in charge of that, part of Doge.
bring in the Doge team, fire them all, call it cost savings. But, okay, the statute of limitations doesn't run out. Another administration comes in. It rebuilds the public corruption task forces that have been sort of dismantled or diminished. And they file charges against people for corruption and graft during the Trump administration. All of a sudden, you'll get Fox News going 24/7, weaponized justice, telling millions of Americans this is all illegitimate, regardless of the facts of the case in many circumstances. And so, you're in a bind. Do you hold people accountable and perhaps create a world in which, bad faith opponents use that to kind of leverage the next round of vengeance? Or do you let things go for the cause of sort of national unity and trying to restore and pull us back from the emotional brink in politics?
Or do you shut down Fox News because they are enemies of the people who are spreading anti-revolutionary propaganda?
Right. Because once you blow through the firewalls of the Bill of Rights, you blow through the firewalls of the Bill of Rights. I mean, and this is something that I've tried to explain to people who say, well, you can't bring them back from El Salvador because, the Supreme Court doesn't have jurisdiction. I'm like, guys, do you really want a world in which the Bill of Rights are hacked so easily that you just pop somebody on a plane, deposit them in a foreign country and say, oops?
Well, there have been several prominent, we'll call them right-wing voices, Jesse Kelly, Sean, what's his name from the Federalist, who have overtly said on Twitter, like, do not listen to the Supreme Court. They are irrelevant. And in some cases, maybe they need to be sent to El Salvador. But, the progressives were saying that sort of thing. I mean, I would be outraged. David, I remember I used to go on MSNBC in like 2009, argue, do not go after Bush people because they were doing their job. They were trying to protect the country. And they were doing what President Bush, deemed that they should be doing. And if they cross the line, if you go after them, we're a banana republic. It's gonna set off this cycle. And I believe that was true at the time. But, at some point, if you constantly let people act with impunity, then they're just going to keep doing it.
And I would bet you if you went and talked to those same individuals you mentioned, the 2014 version of themselves or the early 2015, and say, one day you're going to be calling for the dissolution of the Supreme Court or the defiance of the Supreme Court because they don't want alleged enemy aliens shipped out of the country with no due process at all. They would say, what are you talking about? Of course people get due process. This is basic American constitutional law. But it really does show you the MAGA movement, once it takes an issue and it has this no apology, no retreat, never back down ethos, that is a revolutionary mindset without limits. If you're talking about, one of the things that's very frustrating to me is how the MAGA movement really tries to appropriate the symbols of the American Revolution. The symbols they should be appropriating are the symbols of the French Revolution, because this is much more of a Jacobin movement than it is anything recognizable in Madisonian democracy, Hamiltonian. George Washington would look at this movement and just be utterly, utterly, utterly appalled by what they are. But they would look pretty familiar to some of the radicals in the French Revolution. Wreck everything, reboot, reset, total destruction, purging of enemies. All of this is very familiar to historians of the French Revolution. And so, the appropriation of the American revolutionary symbols by this movement isn't just grievous as a matter of morality. It's actually inaccurate as a matter of history, because they're a lot more like Robespierre than they are like Washington.
Well, let me ask you about this Alien Enemies Act, which I think the Supreme Court has not yet taken up. And I think they may determine that indeed Trump should not have invoked it because we're, this is not like a time of war. These people are not really terrorists. They were not sent here by the government of Venezuela to infiltrate or whatever the criteria is to invoke that. But if let's assume for a minute that the Alien Enemies Act is correctly being used, does that say that immigrants are not entitled to due process or to less due process?
No, no, no.
The standard isn't lower.
The standard is not lower. So the writ of habeas corpus is preserved. I mean, look, we have throughout American history, even going back into the War on Terror, we have multiple cases from the War on Terror involving applying the writ of habeas corpus to Guantanamo Bay detainees, for example. So these are foreign nationals imprisoned under a suspicion of being a terrorist, aiding and abetting terrorism after the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. And there was due process, habeas relief potential. There was ability to challenge your charges. I mean, the amount of due process that suspected al-Qaeda detainees have at Guantanamo far exceeds that of these El Salvadoran deportees in the prison in El Salvador. And so they're going further than we went in the War on Terror. And Matt, just to give you a sense of the absurdity of this, the 3 previous times when the Alien Enemies Act have been invoked, or the War of 1812, when we're fighting a global superpower in Great Britain that was powerful enough to burn Washington to the ground. World War I, when we're fighting Imperial Germany, which to that point had defeated Russia and had both France and Britain on their heels. And then the third time was World War II, when we're taking on Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And then the fourth time, it's for this Venezuelan drug gang. One of these is not like the other. The other 3 are manifestations of when the act was intended to be invoked. And even when it was invoked in World War II, in this giant existential threat to the United States, there were review boards and review panels put up all over America so that alleged alien enemies could contest their status. And this happened in World War II. And yet you're saying now, because of a Venezuelan drug gang, we have to get rid of due process, habeas corpus, etc. What are we doing here? I mean, if you even have an ounce of historical perspective, you can see how wild all this is.
But I guess if you send someone who's not a citizen to another country, then you can claim, hey,
try to wash your hands. Yeah, wash your hands. Now, it's so, and the bad faith here is just so obvious. I mean, this is an administration who thinks it could bend all of the nation of Canada to its will, the nation of Mexico to its will. It can bend the world to its will through its tariff wars and all of this stuff. But by golly, we just can't get a guy out of El Salvador.
Yeah, nothing we can do. We don't have the power.
Nothing we can do. I mean, yeah. I know we're paying millions of dollars to keep him and others there, but nothing we can do. I think that's why that conduct is why the court, and with only 2 dissents, entered this highly unusual after midnight order on Friday night after midnight to restrain the Trump administration, because they can see what's happening just as easily as we can.
To stop them from deporting more Venezuelans.
Yeah.
In the meantime, until.
Yeah.
So it was Alito and who else?
Alito and Thomas were in dissent, essentially arguing that it was premature, that the court moved too quickly to intervene. But I guarantee you, so this happened in a 2-step process. Everybody needs to know how this went. Step 1 was, we're going to decide in a 5-4 decision, but all 9 in agreement on one key point, that you get habeas relief, you get a opportunity to notice and an opportunity to be heard before you're deported under the Alien Enemies Act. That was crystal clear. All 9 justices agreed with that. And so that's the rule. And then you get notice and opportunity to be heard. What evidence did the Supreme Court get right before it issued its ruling? The ACLU alleged that these people are about to be deported, receiving notices of the charges against them or the reason for the deportation in English only, with no opportunity to call a lawyer. Well, that obviously defies the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court's moving very quickly to try to stop that. This is an action of a court that says, hey, Trump administration, we gave you a chance to do the right thing the right way in this 5-4 decision where we threw you some bones, and then you didn't do it. You did not do things the right way. And so now we're going to be a lot more blunt. We're going to intervene a lot more dramatically. And I think that 1-2 punch, a lot of people are overlooking that. They gave the Trump administration an opportunity to carry out their plans in a rational and sensible manner. The Trump administration decided not to do that. And then they come in with this overwhelming, this after midnight, highly unusual opinion that really, if the Trump administration complies, will stop its deportations of under the Aliens Enemies Act in their tracks.
All right, I'm going to resist the urge to go down multiple rabbit holes here. I'm not going to tell you how I love Scalia, but now can't stand Alito. That used to be called Scalito. I'm not going to, I'm not going to indulge in all of that. But I do want to ask you before I get you out of here, because it's somewhat related. This past week, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and I think it was like a town hall meeting or something, said, "We are all afraid."
Yeah.
And later, like a sentence or two later, said it's because of, quote, retaliation. So here you see, it seems like we're having a sitting U.S. senator admitting publicly that she is afraid of speaking out or doing her job because she's afraid of Trump and his supporters retaliating against her in some manner. And I don't think it's just primarying her, because she's already survived that kind of thing. I mean, then, this came, I think, on the heels of Governor Josh Shapiro's house being set on fire. I think his family was inside. That appears to be an anti-Semitic, not specifically a political attack. But what it has in common is that, man, we're really getting normalized or used to political violence right now. And I don't know where this leads, but it keeps happening.
I'm glad she said it. She said out loud what a lot of public officials think and say privately. I don't know if you remember, right after January 6th, Peter Meyer, who's one of the few House Republicans who voted to impeach Trump, was talking about how on the day of January 6th, there were Republican members of Congress who wanted to vote to certify the election. They did not believe the election was stolen at all, but they were worried. They voted not to certify because they were worried for the safety of themselves and their families. This is something that's happening all over the country. School board members, it's happening to them. Election workers, happening to them. Members of Congress, happening to them. It's not exclusively the right threatening the left, by the way. The left threatens the right as well, as we've seen.
Trump survived an assassination attempt. I mean, that guy just seems to have been crazy. I don't know if he had a political agenda, but, do want to point that out.
Yeah, I mean, and somebody tried to assassinate Kavanaugh, and there was the softball shooting, the congressional baseball shooting. Nobody should say that political violence is flowing all from the right to the left. It's flowing in all directions, but it's absolutely the case that if you oppose MAGA and you have a public platform, you should expect threats and acts of intimidation. I mean, this is just the playbook. And so I'm glad Senator Murkowski said that. I'm glad that she that she said out loud, like what a lot of people think. But this is the situation. It is grim. If you have a public voice, if you disagree with MAGA, be prepared to face some pretty extreme consequences. And that's not always been the case in the United States.
I'm glad she's speaking out, but I wish, I think if four Republican senators banded together and said, nothing's going to happen until Abrego Garcia is back, until you get on the list of the most egregious things that have been happening, nothing's going to happen until they would have some leverage. And so, yeah, you could talk about being afraid, but I don't know. Did she vote to confirm Pete Hegseth? I don't remember. She might have. She might have voted against the confirmation, but you get my drift here.
Yeah.
Where I'm going with this.
Well, and also, look, the judges are equally vulnerable to threats as senators, and yet judges are standing up to Trump again and again, both Democratic nominated and Republican nominated judges.
Reagan nominee recently.
Judge Wilkinson in the Fourth Circuit absolutely scorched the administration. You had all three of Trump's appointees joining this decision, this after midnight decision, blocking further deportations under the Alien Enemies Act. They face threats, they face intimidation, yet they're standing up. What is your excuse, senators? What is your excuse? I mean, you have resources to for protection, law enforcement resources. So do the judges. But the judges are standing up. Members of Congress are not. And yes, there is a difference. Judges have life tenure. Would they stand up as much if they had to face re-election? I don't know. But they are standing in the face of threats. They are standing in the face of intimidation. One of the tactics that's happening now is that Judges are finding that they're getting like late night pizza deliveries of pizza they didn't order. It's just sending them a message. We know where you live. I've talked to a judge who's received that exact kind of message. So they are receiving threats. They are receiving, people are trying to intimidate them, and yet they're doing their job. Congress is not doing its job, and it is absolutely damaging our republic.
Well, I don't know anybody else who could have this conversation ranging from faith to military to legal expertise. So, David French, any final words, anything I should have asked?
Final word is Grizzlies in 5. They lost by 51 points to the Oklahoma City Thunder, but that's just going to light a fire. It's going to light a fire, Matt. So that's my final word.
He can also talk sports and pop culture, folks. So he's a 5-tool player, as they call him in the trade. David French, always a pleasure, man. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.